Hi, class. This is lesson 2 of Unit 5. This lecture is going to be a relatively shorter one, and it's not really going to talk too much about politics. I told you in the last lecture that I would be talking more about what was happening with your more average Americans during this time period. So keep in mind that American history is not just the history of the leaders, it's not just the history of people in government, it's not just the history of the economy. There are social issues that occur, things like that. There are more personal things that happen that affect more everyday Americans, and this lecture will talk more about that. So I'll be very little talking about uh, President Jackson, even though President Jackson was in office during a good portion of the antebellum period. Let me remind you real quickly that the antebellum period refers to the time in American history before the Civil War. Antebellum, again, meaning the time before the war in Latin. So basically, this is the time period from around the creation of the Constitution to the Civil War. And during this time, over the course of these decades, there will be many changes in society. And notice that I'm not even putting political in this one because we've talked plenty about political events and changes. I will talk about social changes first, and that will largely focus on immigration and the responses of Americans to immigrants. You should be able to see some historical parallels between what I talk about here and maybe more modern events. Basically, historically, Americans have not always been that welcoming to immigrant groups. It's not a new thing. More on that later. I'll talk about a religious movement that takes place, and that will be the Second Great Awakening. We've already talked about the Great Awakening that occurred during the colonial period, or the First Great Awakening, and this time we'll talk about the Second Great Awakening and its effects. We'll talk about philosophical changes that occur, and especially the transcendentalist movement. These are things that if you take English classes, you learn about the transcendentalists, so I don't talk real heavily about transcendentalism itself. And I will talk then about how some different groups of Americans kind of experimented with some of these new philosophies that they began to believe in, some of these new religious beliefs. And then finally, I'll talk about the limits on these changes. Basically, these are changes that occur in the North and the West, and not so much in the South. So ultimately, these social changes, these cultural changes, will feed into sectionalism between the North and the West on one side and the South on the other. Okay, so let's talk about social changes first, and specifically, let's talk about immigration that occurs. If you look at the charts at the bottom, really just look at the left-hand chart. That's the one that really applies to the time period before the Civil War. The other one is after the Civil War. You don't need to worry about that at this point. So if you're looking at the charts, only look at the one on the left. The immigrant waves that occurred during the antebellum period before the Civil War, these immigrants are oftentimes referred to as old immigrants. Whenever you get into the post-Civil War time period, which is largely American history too, you'll talk about another wave of immigrants known as new immigrants, but again, for the sake of this class, worry about old immigrants, so the immigrants before the Civil War. And if you look, there are three major groups looking at the chart here. You'll see that the British are going to come in, the Irish are going to come in, and the Germans are going to come in. There will be immigrants from other areas, but the main two that you need to worry about will be the Germans and the Irish. So yes, there are British immigrants that come over. They don't really have that much of a problem fitting into American society because culturally they are very similar to those that were already here. However, the Germans and especially the Irish are going to be met with some resistance and some hostility. Anytime there is a wave of immigration from an area, a new area, and the wave is a big wave of immigration, you tend to see anti-immigrant feeling known as nativism. And you've seen that throughout American history, even today. Back in the antebellum period, people weren't liking the Irish and the Germans. So let's talk about those two groups. I'll talk about the Germans first. So the Germans, and go down the left-hand chart first, then we'll go down the right-hand chart. So the first country of origin will be Germany. So the German immigrants are going to come in, and they're largely going to come in because things aren't very stable politically in Germany at the time. And the details of that you don't really need to know, but just note that there is political unrest in Germany. There are some attempted revolutions in Germany, and a lot of Germans come to the United States for political freedom. So this idea of the United States being a beacon of freedom to the world, well, that kind of comes into play when it comes to German immigrants. Where do these German immigrants come in? The German immigrants largely come into the Midwestern part of the country, kind of shown here in this chart. You can see that people of German ancestry tend to move into these areas, which are more rural areas, a lot of them more farm-based areas. And the reason that they move to that area is because they move, and when they come over, they have some money and they can afford to do things like buy some farmland. So many of them are going to be middle class, are going to have some basic education and skills. And a lot of them, whenever they move to the United States, they're going to start up small farms. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I do believe they bring the kind of iconic red barn to the United States. Uh, or they'll start up businesses. Again, whenever they come to the United States, they do have some skills, they do have some money, and they oftentimes do uh, uh, start up their own farms, start up their own businesses. When it comes to anti-immigrant feeling towards the Germans, it will be there, especially because of the language barrier. They speak German, most Americans speak English, but the anti-immigrant feeling, aka the nativism they feel, will be less intense than you see with the Irish. And why will the Irish be disliked more? I'll get into that later on, but note that both the Germans and the Irish are going to experience nativism. And I'll define nativism formally here in a moment. But first, let's talk about the Irish. So if you look at the Irish immigration according to this chart at the bottom, you'll see that the Irish immigration kind of peaks in the 1840s, which would be in the later part of the Antebellum period. So the Irish obviously are coming from Ireland. Why are they coming? The reason that they're coming is different than why the Germans are coming. They're coming because basically their country is in poverty. There was a famine going on in Ireland. A lot of the Irish economy and the basis of food was based on potatoes, and there was a disease spreading among the potato crop, and basically this potato famine, which a lot of you have probably learned about in world history, is going to leave a lot of the Irish starving, very poor. I think the number was something like 2 million Irish died because of this. It was there, whatever the numbers were high. They're starving, they're desperate, and you can assume that they're also going to be poor. If they're starving to death, they must not have much money, which means they don't have the ability to buy land of their own. So where are they going to move? They're going to move into the cities in the northeastern part of the country, into the north. And they're going to move into what would be called sometimes tenements, which would be basically the same thing as an apartment. Now, typically, if people are too poor to buy their own house or buy their own land, what they end up doing is they end up renting from someone else that owns land or housing. In other words, they rent from a landlord that owns an apartment. So what do the Irish do? They tend to move into the cities and they tend to start renting from landlords that own apartments, aka tenements. Now, if they can't buy their own land, then that speaks to the fact that they are going to be poor. A lot of them don't have very many skills to bring to the United States. And knowing that they don't have many skills and knowing that they're living in the cities, you can kind of guess what they're going to do for a living. Well, they're not going to be starting up their own farms. They're not going to be starting up their own businesses. If they're poor, they're unskilled, they're living in the cities, what they are going to be working in the factories. And this is going to create problems because remember, a lot of Americans that were born in this country are also going to be moving into the cities, oftentimes for these factory jobs. So you're going to see, especially with the Irish, fighting over jobs. So a lot of times, nativism or anti-immigrant feeling is tied to this idea that immigrants are quote unquote taking people's jobs. Depending on the time period, the truth in that statement is debatable. But during this time, oftentimes the Irish were accused of stealing the jobs of Americans that were already here, especially unskilled jobs. So I talked a little bit about labor unions. One of the problems that labor unions are going to have is that if they decide to go on strike, well, the factory owner is just going to hire in the poor Irish immigrants that are willing to work for even less. More on that notion in a moment. So, what is going to be the result of this wave of immigration of of what are known as old immigrants, the antebellum immigrants from before the Civil War, the Germans and the Irish mainly? There is going to be nativism. So, you need to highlight that term. That is one of your key terms. Nativism in general is a feeling of hostility towards foreigners, especially immigrants coming to the United States. And throughout history, there have been many reasons for nativism, and sometimes these reasons tend to repeat themselves. So, one of the main reasons for nativism is going to be a language barrier, especially with the Germans. Germans did not speak English, at least not when they first came to the United States. And a language barrier can be an incredibly divisive social barrier. If you don't understand what someone else is saying, you're not going to be able to communicate with them. You're not going to be able to maybe even recognize the humanity in them as well. It's going to create tension. And even today, you can hear people sometimes when they express nativist views, they might say that they don't think that immigrants should be able to come into the United States unless they speak English. Now, remember, there is no official language to the United States. There's a dominant one, which is English, but there is no official one. Again, Germans are going to face nativism because of a language barrier, especially. Another reason that both the Germans and the Irish are going to face nativism is because of their cultural attitudes towards alcohol. So during this time, the Germans stereotypically were big beer drinkers, and the Irish were stereotypically big liquor drinkers. And in the United States at the time, the Americans already here, they drank pretty liberally too. But at this point in history, there's starting to be a social movement against heavy drinking. That will be known as the temperance movement, and I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. It's going to be one of the results of the Second Great Awakening. So basically, what happens is both of these liberally drinking immigrant groups are going to arrive in the United States at a time when a lot of Americans are starting to second guess alcohol and alcohol use, and they're starting to kind of turn against it, at least to a degree. And these immigrants kind of go against that mood of the country that is becoming less permissive towards alcohol. Another major reason, and that kind of relates to the picture that you see at the top here, is is that the nativism. Well, one, nativism is stronger towards the Irish, and one of the biggest things that creates nativism in general, in this case towards the Irish, is the idea of immigrants taking jobs. So what ends up happening is, again, the Irish are going to be accused of stealing factory jobs. They are poor, they are desperate, they are living in the cities near the factories, and again, there's this association that they are stealing jobs, or this notion that they are stealing jobs from American factory workers. So a lot of times what you would see is help wanted signs like you see here at the top, and here it says help wanted, no Irish need apply. In other words, this particular either factory or small business doesn't want to even allow the Irish to apply for jobs because jobs belong only to Americans, according to this point of view. One other reason that you're going to see nativism, again, remember there is no official language in this country, there is no official religion in this country either. And there is, however, a dominant religion in this country. And the dominant religion, kind of generally speaking, in this country is Christianity. More specific, you could say Protestant Christian. When I say Protestant, I basically mean the churches that depend almost exclusively on the authority of the Bible and not on church traditions. So your Protestant churches would be churches like Baptist, like Methodist, like Lutheran, like Presbyterian, Episcopalian, uh, not Catholic. If you want me to be really simple, I'll say basically Protestant churches are the not Catholic churches, although there are churches that exist that are neither Catholic nor Protestant, such as the Orthodox Church. But for the sake of this class, keep in mind that there are two main branches of Christianity in the United States, the dominant one being Protestant, and then you have Catholics. The majority of the Irish and many of the Germans were Catholics. And Catholics and Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians do not agree on all points of theology. And today there's a lot more tolerance between the churches than there was back then. And there was this fear that the Catholic Church was going to take over the United States through Irish and German immigrants. And if you know anything about Catholicism, you know that the church, the head of the church on earth, would be considered the Pope. And there were some fears that if there were too many Catholics in the United States, then the Catholics would take over the Protestant Christians, and then the Pope would basically rule the country as almost a puppet country of his. That's never happened, but that was a fear that some Americans had at this point. So there's tension over language issues. There's the language barrier. You have tension over social issues like the use of alcohol. You have economic tension over the idea that the Irish are stealing factory jobs, and there is religious tension as well. Now let's go to this particular fear of the Catholics, especially in a moment. Let me first show you this political cartoon. And if you look at this political cartoon, you'll see the polls back here, which is where people vote. You see people fighting at the polls, and you see who is stealing the ballot box, who's getting all the votes. The Germans, this German immigrant being shown to be in a big beer barrel. And then you see this Irish immigrant being shown to be in a big whiskey barrel. So here you see that tension over their attitudes towards alcohol, but also in general, there's this fear that if the Irish and the Germans come in and they come in too big of numbers, they're going to basically take over the country. How can they take over the country? By being so big a number that they outvote all of the, if you will, native-born Americans. Long story short, a lot of Americans are afraid that these immigrants are taking over the country. Okay, so back to this idea of anti-Catholic nativism. There's actually going to be a political party that forms. It's officially known as the American Party because they felt like they were representing, quote, true America. They have a kind of ironic flag here. They have a flag that says Native Foreign Influence. And when they said Native Americans, they don't mean American Indians. They mean native-born Americans after the American Revolution, the ones of mostly European descent. So there is an irony in that flag. But anyway, so the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, will form, and they were really afraid that immigrants were going to gain too much influence. They wanted there to be more restrictions on immigration. They wanted there to be especially restrictions on any immigrants that were Catholic. Now, this political party will be secretive in nature. And so oftentimes, if someone was asked if they were a part of the American Party, their claim would simply be, I know nothing. And so this party ends up being known as the Know Nothing Party. And they are basically a nativist, anti-immigrant political party. They are especially anti-Catholic. And they were known sometimes to participate in doing things like burning Catholic churches, and they could get violent at times. Now, this political party never wins any elections, but they do end up pulling votes from other major political parties. They do end up pulling votes away from Whigs. Not so much Democrats, but they definitely pull votes away from Whigs and actually, in the end, help contribute to the death of the Whig party in the end. But again, nativism is so strong that you even see an official political party, although it was secretive, although it was a smaller third party. It wasn't one of the two major parties, but it is basically solely created because of nativism. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to another theme, and that will be a religious movement that occurs. And that will be known as the Second Great Awakening. Now remember that in the early part of American history, a lot of the founding fathers actually were not Christians. They were deists. I explained that deists did not really believe in miracles. They didn't believe that God had a uh, a personal relationship with creation. Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, I believe, were both deists. And there had been a general decline in religion in the early part of American history. And so there will be a second Great Awakening, a second major revival of Christianity, or at least certain forms of Christianity in the United States. And the thing that makes the second Great Awakening special is that this revival is going to really emphasize the idea of personal salvation through an individual's relationship with God. And the best modern day parallel I can think of is if you've ever heard of this notion of, quote, getting saved, of asking God to enter your life, enter your heart, and save you based on your personal belief. That's the kind of what the Second Great Awakening taught. And in fact, some churches even today still reflect a lot of the ideals of the Second Great Awakening. Now, again, note that this emphasizes personal salvation. It says basically you don't have to go through a certain church so much, you don't have to go through a certain preacher or priest. It's really between you and God, and that's it, which gives a lot more power to, if you will, the common person or the common man in their salvation and getting saved. And you will ultimately see a kind of merger in this idea of personal salvation for the common man that goes along with the era of the common man that we talked about with Andrew Jackson. I'll talk more about how those two things kind of connect in the next lecture. One of your famous Second Great Awakening preachers will be the man shown on the left, named Charles Finney. He and many other leaders of the Second Great Awakening are going to give very emotional sermons, hellfire and brimstone sermons. And what I'm talking about is the kind of sermon where it's not so much intellectual or academic. It's not so much like a lecture like I'm giving you here. These are the kind of sermons where people might be yelling, they might be crying. There's a lot of emotion involved. And honestly, oftentimes there's a lot of fear involved. And so, whenever you hear the idea of hellfire and brimstone, think of a preaching style that really riles people up and gets them afraid of being damned to hell forever. And therefore, what must they do? They must be saved. And again, many of you that are listening to this lecture, you may attend churches that have this sort of style, this sort of theology, or at least have attended a religious service that kind of reflects what I'm describing here. So, where did or how did a lot of these sermons take place? A lot of them took place in what would be known as camp meetings. And these camp meetings could be enormous. And you still see camp meetings in the United States today. I've driven by signs advertising camp meetings even now, recently. And what would happen at these camp meetings is you would have a preacher give a usually emotionally rousing sermon, oftentimes a hellfire and brimstone sermon, one, in other words, that kind of uses the emotion of fear to wake people up to the notion that they might be going to hell, and then using these emotions, using this idea that you need to ask God to be saved to get people to be saved. And if you look at this picture here, you can see that people are literally falling over themselves because they are so riled up emotionally. And many of them do end up converting in a very emotional fashion to Christianity. Or if they were already Christians, they go from being, if you will, lukewarm Christians to being on fire Christians, very enthusiastic Christians. And then this again ends up being a very moving time in a lot of people's lives. Now, where were these revivals the most intense? They were most intense in the western part of New York. So this would be in the north. The western part of New York, so not New York City, but more in the rural area of New York, is actually where my mother grew up. And if you go to that area of the country, there are churches everywhere of all kinds of denominations. Now you'll notice that I have an arrow that comes from this bullet talking about the burned over district, and I'm going to talk about the creation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, a little bit later on. It basically finds its origins in the burned over district. But basically, the hotbed of this religious revival is going to be Western New York. Why is it called the Burned Over District? Well, remember, I'm talking about hellfire and brimstone here. So it kind of makes sense that this area gets nicknamed the Burned Over area because there was so much talk of hell and being saved from hell uh, in this area of the country. The religious fervor is going to be so intense that it's actually going to give birth, if you will, to a new church in a sense. And I'll get to that later on, that new church being the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. More on that in a moment. Let's talk first about the effects of the Second Great Awakening. Before I talk about the effects here, look at the map. You see this area highlighted here. That will be the burned over district. You did see a good bit of revivalism in Kentucky, which would be considered kind of in the South, but more so in the West. The South really isn't all that affected by the Second Great Awakening. And again, the biggest area of this revival, and you see here it says burned over district, is going to be Western New York, where my mom grew up. And I visited that area, obviously, since I have family there, and there is a lot of American history there that's very interesting. Anyway, so what are the effects of the Second Great Awakening going to be? Well, one of them is that you will see a couple of denominations really start to grow, that being the Baptist and the Methodist. And the Baptist and the Methodist churches, many of you listening may consider yourself Baptist or Methodist. You know that there is an emphasis on the idea of personal salvation, on the idea of being saved. And these two churches, again, are going to grow, and they are very prominent in the United States today, especially in rural areas. One other effect of the Second Great Awakening is that people will again be looking to themselves to be saved. They say, I don't need a specific church. I don't need a specific preacher or a priest. This does not affect the Catholic Church much at all. And so people really look to themselves. They say, all I need to be saved is my personal relationship with God. And so I don't always tell you to put what's in parentheses. It might be a good idea here to write what's in parentheses. This is, in a sense, a common man religion. Church authority isn't going to save you. A preacher or priest that's kind of has authority over you isn't going to save you. Your denomination isn't going to save you. It's you and God. So again, this empowers the common people to have a say in their own salvation. Now, what's interesting is that once people become religious and enthusiastically religious, they start to notice things that they see in society as sins. And they're going to start saying that these things that go against my renewed Christian faith, we need to get rid of them in society. So, for example, they might say that alcohol is a sin, or alcohol use is a sin, or at least alcohol abuse is a sin. So we need to reduce, if not remove, alcohol from society. Some people are going to say that the treatment of the mentally ill is a major issue that needs to be addressed, and humane treatment of people in prisons or in mental institutions. That's a big source of reform. However, one of the biggest sins in society, in other words, one of the biggest issues that people affected by the Second Great Awakening, one of the biggest issues that they're going to see needing addressed is going to be the issue of slavery. They're going to say that one of the biggest sins against God is the enslavement of humans to each other. Now, whenever people start getting motivated by the Second Great Awakening to oppose slavery, you can easily see why this movement is largely in the North and in the West and not very popular in the South. In fact, a lot of churches split over the issue of slavery. The Baptist Church will split. That's why you have the Southern Baptist Church today, is because the Southern Baptist split with the Northern Baptist over the issue of slavery. The Southern Christians were not quick or willing to admit that slavery was a sin. In fact, their brand of Christianity actually justified slavery. Now, that being said, obviously the Southern Baptists today do not believe in slavery in any way, shape, or form. This would have been something that happened in the early 1800s during the Antebellum period. So again, the fact that the the Second Great Awakening leads people to want to reform society, especially over the issue of slavery. That's going to cause the Second Great Awakening to be much less in terms of influence in the South. Southerners that needed slavery oftentimes for economic reasons, or put up with slavery because of racist reasons, or some combination of the two. Southerners are not going to be a big fan of the Second Great Awakening when Second Great Awakening preachers start to preach about the evils of slavery. And we'll talk more about this later on because eventually a lot of people that become religious start to attack slavery very aggressively. They will be known as the abolitionists, and you'll have the birth of the abolitionist movement. I'll talk about that by the end of this unit in the fourth lecture. Okay, now let's go back to the Second Great Awakening, and especially to the burned over district, the area that I'm circling in the map here. There's going to be a young man that lives, well, I believe he grew up in Vermont, but he ends up moving to Western New York. And his name is Joseph Smith, and he is going to be very, if you will, kind of filled with this religious enthusiasm. But he sees churches popping up. He sees the Baptist church, he sees the Methodist church, he sees other denominations starting to pop up, uh, other ones starting to grow, and he asks himself, which church should I join? Which one, if you will, is the correct church? And his name is Joseph Smith. So he is living in the burned over district, and he is going to go into the woods and basically pray to God and say, God, which church should I join? Which one is the correct church? And I've actually been in this forest grove where he claimed to have had these visions. And basically, he's going to say that he's going to be visited. If I remember correctly, he's visited a couple of times, at least a couple of times. I think once by Jesus himself, and then another time by an angel named Moroni. And in the end, his visions are going to tell him that he needs to restore, if you will, the true Christian church. So the other churches had their good points, but none of the churches, if you will, were purely the way the original church was, and God is going to instruct Joseph Smith to restore the true church. And so he does. He proceeds over the years to write what becomes known as the Book of Mormon through his interactions with divine beings. And this is not going to go over very well with locals. So he's going to establish what's called officially the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Members of this church call themselves Latter-day Saints. Outsiders oftentimes call them Mormons. And in the end, this Mormon church that grows is going to end up being persecuted by a lot of locals. A lot of people convert to this church and convert to the beliefs that Joseph Smith is teaching, but a lot of other people are not a big fan of this church. A lot of them don't like the fact that Smith is claiming to be leading the restoration of the truest form of Christianity. Eventually, members of the church start practicing polygamy, which means basically a man having multiple wives. Now, why would they justify this? Well, one reason to justify this would be that if we are trying to establish the true church, then we should grow our population as quickly as possible. It's kind of behind the same idea behind the Puritans having so many children, although they did not believe in having multiple wives. Now, today, the vast majority of Latter-day Saints do not believe in polygamy, but at the time that was accepted by them, not accepted by outsiders. So they are going to face a lot of persecution, and they are going to be driven out of the burned over district, out of New York, all the way westward towards Illinois. Now, when they get to Illinois, the Mormons under Joseph Smith are not going to be too welcomed. There is going to be some tension between the Mormons and the non-Mormons in the area. They form a town called Nauvoo, Nauvoo. Not that you need to be able to spell that, but there you go. And they are going to, again, have this as a kind of sanctuary for the Mormons. However, they are not going to be well received by the people of Illinois. And eventually what happens is that Joseph Smith is going to be arrested and put in jail. And then whenever he's in jail, a mob will gather at the jail cell, and he will be in the second floor window. And as he's at the second floor window, this mob is going to kill Joseph Smith. And at this point, a lot of the Latter day Saints or Mormons, I'll use the terms interchangeably, it looked like the movement was going to fall apart. But at this moment, another leader, and oftentimes these leaders are considered prophets, they are considered to be in more direct communication with God than, if you will, the average person. A new leader will arise named Brigham Young, and you see Brigham Young pictured on the right-hand side of this slide. And what Brigham Young is going to say to the Mormons is, do not give up, do not leave the faith. What we must do is move west. We must move to a place where we can escape persecution. And he is going to lead them on a very long trek. This is almost like the Trail of Tears in that it was very difficult, and not a lot of people did die along the way, but this was done voluntarily. In a sense. I mean, in a sense, they felt like they had to because they were escaping persecution, but they weren't being literally directly forced to go. But they are going to go, led by Brigham Young, all the way to Utah, which at the time was not even part, not yet, of the United States officially. It was still part of Mexico. And they are going to move all the way to Utah to escape religious persecution. And this should remind you of something else from earlier in American history. Remember the Puritans, whenever they created their church, they ended up moving west from England ultimately to the New England colonies to escape persecution. And the Puritans, once they reached the New England area, after enduring a harsh winter, remember, they prospered and grew in population quite a bit. Well, the Mormons are going to do the same thing. They're going to move to what today is known to most people as Salt Lake City, and they will create Salt Lake City, and there they will grow, they will prosper, and basically create a new society for themselves where they see themselves as being free from persecution. If you go to Utah today, it is dominantly Mormon in population. And again, if you look at this map here, you can see Palmyra, where the church starts, which is actually my mom's hometown. And eventually, though the Mormons are going to be moved to escape persecution in New York, they're going to move to Nauvoo here in Illinois. And there they face more problems. And ultimately, led by Brigham Young, remember that Joseph Smith dies here. And then Brigham Young takes over, and they go all the way to what is now Salt Lake City. And they had actually this idea of creating an entire country that's highlighted in the map right in here that would be called Deseret. Ultimately, that does not occur. Ultimately, this area will be turned into states. Ultimately, this area will be taken from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, and then later on turned into states. But as you can see, the Mormons had big plans for their church. And again, if you go to Utah today, there are lots of Mormon temples, especially in Salt Lake City, and the dominant population is Mormon, which is a very interesting thing to experience. I recommend visiting Utah at some point. Okay, now on to another theme, and that will be a philosophical shift in American history, and that'll be transcendentalism. And if you take in English, usually junior English covers this. There will be a philosophy, especially among a lot of authors, known as transcendentalism. And a simple way to think of this is almost like an antebellum version of hippies. That's probably an oversimplified way of thinking of it, but still think of kind of like 1800s hippies. These are going to be people that really stress non-traditional living, and in some ways, they're going to stress more of the relationship between humans and nature. They like to spend lots of time out in the woods, out in nature. They really like the idea of not worrying so much about what your brain said, but by following your gut or by your heart. Following your heart, they really believed in this idea of following your intuition. They were anti-materialist. Remember that this is occurring during the Industrial Revolution, where you have lots of people forming these businesses and making the business owners are making lots of money. and you do see this rise in materialism, this rise in the idea of just making money so you can buy things. They don't care, the transcendentalists, about that so much. They say it's fine to be poor. You should be more worried about spiritual matters, although they were not always very big fans of official churches. They felt like there was a lot of corruption in churches. I think they felt like you got a lot more out of nature when it came to spiritual matters than you would get from a church. And your most famous, or one of your, I'm going to talk about two famous transcendentalists. The first one that I'll talk about will be Ralph Waldo Emerson, and his writings are going to be very much in favor of nature, very much in line with this idea of individualism. There's a phrase that comes along around this time about marching to the beat of your own drum, or to the beat of your own drummer. Uh, a more modern phrase among teenagers might be "you do you." This idea of doing what you feel is right, following your gut, not doing things just to satisfy the expectations of others. So people like Emerson are going to write about nature, the beauty of nature, the spiritual value of nature, and they're going to also, again, very much promote the idea of individualism, doing your own thing, not worrying about what other people think, not following other people's expectations. So Emerson will be one of these people. The other one I'll expand upon a little bit more because he has one specific writing that plays into American history big time later on. And that will be Henry David Thoreau. So he will also write about nature. He actually goes and spends a couple of years living next to a pond called Walden Pond up in the north, and he just writes about his experiences of nature there. So he very much was into this spiritual connection with nature. But the other major writing of his that I want you to maybe put a star next to or highlight is civil disobedience. So he writes about this idea of civil disobedience. What civil disobedience is this notion that if you feel like a law is unjust, a law is wrong, you should protest it. However, notice this, and I probably should have put this in bold, he believed in non-violent protest. He said if you think the laws are bad, you should protest, but you should always protest non-violently. And that's definitely worth noting, because when the abolitionist movement starts up, the fierce anti-slavery movement starts up, there will be some abolitionists that promote violence in order to get rid of slavery. The problem is that whenever you promote violence, you usually lose your credibility. And people don't pay attention to you very much, and they see you as being dangerous or crazy or un-American. Now, if you protest and you protest non-violently, it makes you look much more like the good guy, if you will. So when the abolitionist movement comes along, there will be violent abolitionists that don't have as much credibility. People like William Lloyd Garrison, people like John Brown, I'll talk about them later on. But you'll also have people that believe in protesting, but in protesting non-violently. For example, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, and like Henry David Thoreau, who gain a lot more credibility because they believe in non-violent protest. Real quickly, I'll talk about something from American history too. Martin Luther King Jr. Why is he so well respected in American history? Why was he so effective as a leader, as a civil rights leader that actually got laws passed to ensure more racial equality in this country? It's because of his fierce belief in non-violent protest. Had Martin Luther King Jr. been violent, people would have ignored him. Because he was non-violent, any of his protests that occurred, if they were met with violence from white supremacists, it made it very obvious that King was on the right side of history, and it gained him legitimacy. So this idea of civil disobedience will live on. You'll see it exercised by some abolitionists during the Mexican-American War that were against the war because they saw it as a plot to expand slavery. More on that later. You'll see it later on in American history with the actions of Martin Luther King Jr. So again, civil disobedience, this idea of nonviolent protest, is extremely important. If you want to get changes made in society, you have to do so nonviolently, and you have to do so honestly also through the political process. You can't just start riots up. You can't just go break things. People won't listen to you. You have to be nonviolent, which makes you more credible, and you have to work through the government. You have to get laws passed. And I'll talk more about that idea of nonviolently getting involved in the political process to create positive changes in the next lecture, which will be about a lot of antebellum reform movements. Okay, now there were some people, let's go on to this next chart. There were some people that believed that basically society as a whole could not be fixed. Civil disobedience wouldn't be enough. Uh, you can't end slavery, it's too big of a thing to stop at this point. So some people said if you can't fix society, then basically uh, create your own mini society within the United States. And if the whole of society can't be fixed, you can, at least with people that have common beliefs, live out your own ideas, your own ideals. And those would be known as utopian communities. There were many of them. You could consider the Mormons to be a utopian community that left and basically formed their own utopian community over in the Utah area. But there were others. In general, utopian communities were places where people lived out their ideals of a perfect society. Remember, the word utopia means a perfect society. So again, these utopian communities will pop up according to different ideals. Some of them will be because of philosophical ideals. You'll see transcendentalists try to form their utopian communities. You'll also see some based on religion. You've got the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You have other groups known, for example, the Shakers. I'll talk about them later on. But basically, you have lots of different groups of people form their own kind of mini communities where they can live out their ideals. The best modern, more local example would be maybe the Amish. If you know about the Amish, they tend to believe that life should be lived much more simply. They tend to turn away from more modern technologies. They probably wouldn't be a big fan of online teaching, to be honest. But you'll notice that the Amish tend to live, if you know of any Amish communities, there are some in North Carolina, there are some in Pennsylvania, and other parts of the country. They do tend to kind of live in their own communities where they live out their ideals. So I'm going to talk about three major ones, and then I'll move on to the close of this lecture. So the first one will be known as Brook Farm, and that's not the subject of this picture. I'll talk about this picture in a moment. So Brook Farm will be a farm that forms, and it will be a group of transcendentalists, and they're going to run a farming community, and they are going to have some ideas that are kind of groundbreaking for their time. They are going to be complete pacifists, which they would have had in common with Quakers. Another thing that they would have in common with Quakers, but not many other groups, would be the idea of, if not complete equality for women, at least more equality for women. And again, they will believe in the philosophies of transcendentalism and being close with nature. What profession brings you closer to nature than farming? Not many. Now, ultimately, what's going to happen is this Brook Farm is not going to survive. There's going to I think it was a fire that burned down the main barn of their farm, and they couldn't afford to rebuild it. So they basically fell apart ultimately because of financial reasons. The Shakers, and that is what's shown in the picture here, this was a religious community, and they believed in complete equality of the sexes between men and women. However, they also believed in segregating men and women. So even though men and women were equal, they were supposed to stay separate. And you can see this in the picture here. You'll see on the side you have this section of pews for the women, and then you have this section of pews for the men. Now, where did the Shakers get their name? They got their name because whenever they were in their religious ceremonies, they would do this kind of dance that oftentimes involved them kind of shaking, maybe even uncontrollably, moving very almost erratically, and that's where they get their nickname. And if you look at this picture here, you can see that they're kind of dancing in circles, but notice the circles are segregated. You have the men in this circle, and then you have the women in the next circle in, and so forth. So they believed in equality of the sexes, but also in segregating the sexes. Now, they did have another belief that made them fairly unpopular with a lot of people, and that is that they believed in celibacy. Celibacy means no sex, no intercourse. And I mean not just outside of marriage, but even within marriage. You can see why the Shakers are going to have a problem. Number one is that a lot of people are going to say, well, I'm not going to join a community that says that sex is never allowed, not even within marriage. But another problem is that they really can't add to their group except by recruiting new members. They can't give birth to new members because they don't believe in sex. And so there is going to be no natural reproduction of Shakers. They can only grow through recruiting new members. Do the Shakers exist today? Technically, yes. I'm making this lecture in early 2019, and as of this point, there are two Shakers that are still in existence. They live in Maine as a brother and a sister, and that is it. At its peak, the Shakers were at 6,000 in membership. In 2019, they are down to 2. So it's safe to say that the Shakers fail largely because they couldn't recruit members, they couldn't grow their group. And then on to the next group, and this is a very interesting one. And to avoid controversy, I'll try not to give too many details about them, and that will be Oneida community. So Oneida, what they believed in was basically in sharing everything. And I do mean everything. So if you look at this picture here, for example, obviously they do believe in having children uh, uh, and having sex because you see children here, but they believed in sharing children in the sense that everybody was a parent to every child. So, you know that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child? Well, they took that phrase fairly literally. And again, all the children were considered to be children of all the parents. But again, they believed in sharing everything. Uh, so they shared property, uh, and most controversially, they even shared spouses. So this is almost like an antebellum version of swingers. They called this complex marriage. It did require consent by all members involved, but they did share spouses. And again, this will be controversial with many people. A lot of people felt like this was immoral. And so eventually, Oneida is going to have to find another way to survive. And what they end up doing is they end up giving up on complex marriage. They end up giving up on a lot of their philosophies, and they end up starting a company that makes silverware. So next time you look at your family silverware, look and see if it has the word Oneida on it. And yes, that is the same Oneida that I'm talking about now. And you could probably start a very interesting dinner conversation by talking about the origins of the company Oneida that makes silverware. They started out as a utopian community in New York during the Antebellum period that had some very interesting and controversial lifestyles, which they no longer practice today. Today, it's basically a company, but that's where they came from. Ultimately, though, these utopian communities fail. They have financial problems like Brook Farm. Their farm couldn't sustain itself after the barn burned down. The Shakers could not recruit members. Oneida only survived because they basically convert into a company and they pretty much give up on all of their utopian ideas. So really, the original Oneida doesn't exist anymore either. So ultimately, the utopian communities fail. Now, the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if you consider them a utopian community, they are a rather large one at this point, and they are doing just fine. But most utopian communities did ultimately fail. These experiments in living up to utopian or ideas of perfection, these ideals, most of them do not succeed. Okay, finally, let's talk about the limits on cultural movements. And again, to get full credit on your notes, you have to have everything filled out, so you need to listen. What goes in the middle oval? What will be the common theme of the next 3 items? The common theme will be limits on of cultural movements. So in the middle oval, put limits of cultural movements. Because these cultural movements didn't happen everywhere. You did not see, for example, immigration happen everywhere. You didn't see the Second Great Awakening happening everywhere. You didn't see transcendentalism or utopian communities occurring everywhere. Okay, so number 1, so the upper left section of this chart, Most movements were limited to the northern part of the country or the western part of the country. And in the case of the Mormons, the very far western part of the country, which would have been Utah, which wasn't even part of the country at the time they went out there. But let me condense. Most of the movements were limited to the north and to the west. The south, on to number two, had very little change in terms of immigration or religion or philosophy or utopian communities. Why is that? Well, number one, if you're an immigrant, you're already going to face nativism or discrimination in the northern part of the country or the western part of the country. The South already has a reputation for discrimination against blacks, against slaves. And immigrants do not want to move to an area that's already treating slaves the way that slaves are being treated. On top of that, if you're moving to the United States, you're not going to move to the South because if you're trying to find a job, you're not going to be able to compete with slave labor. So you might as well move where you can compete for a job. You can't compete with free labor. So immigrants would not be able to compete with slaves for labor. In terms of religion, why did religion become so limited, or the Second Great Awakening, why was it so limited in the South? Well, largely because the Second Great Awakening sparked more anti-slavery feelings and caused a lot of people to see slavery as a sin, and the South was not willing to admit that slavery was a sin. Their economic system was so based on slavery that they weren't willing to admit largely that slavery was a sin. The philosophical movements like transcendentalism, the utopian communities, those are not going to happen in the South as much as well. The South typically is more conservative when it comes to big changes. They're already not liking the Second Great Awakening very much. They're not going to be very big fans of the transcendentalist ideology. They're not going to be big fans of utopian communities. The South tends to be slower moving on changes, social changes. So the social changes that do occur happen mainly in the North and the West. So in the South, during all these cultural movements, the South is going to continue to be dominated by slavery. It's going to continue to be economically dominated by cotton production. And again, the cotton is being produced not entirely by slaves, but largely by slaves. Even if you did not own slaves, you still supported slavery largely due to racist ideologies. White supremacy was very strong in the South during this time. And the wealthy planter class basically was doing well as they were. The wealthy planters were making money. Look at the picture at the top. You see kind of your stereotypical large plantation. And basically, the wealthy planters that owned most of the land, had most of the money, had a lot of political influence. They didn't really want to change. And so not much change happened during this time. Now, the Second Great Awakening that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to foreshadow the next lecture now, the Second Great Awakening is going to end up sparking a lot of reform movements, and these reform movements are going to, again, be largely in the North and the West, especially the North, and not so much in the South, and they will actually create more sectionalism between the North and the South. You can see here in this last slide that cultural sectionalism is growing between the northern and western part of the country and the South. And when the north and western part of the country decides to use, especially these religious ideas or these philosophical ideas, to push for reforms, such as getting rid of slavery, the South is going to resist that. So in the next lecture, you'll see this sectionalism, this cultural sectionalism, be made even worse by reform movements that happen largely in the North. More on that in the next lecture.